My name's David White. I'm simply a concerned individual who's been interested in justice issues all of my life.
Great.
I have no vested interests. I don't know anyone who's in prison. My closest association with the justice system is that I have a sister who's a barrister. Not in this state, but in another state. However, I'm different to quite a number of ordinary individuals in that I have had interactions with the justice system over the years. I have been in court, and I was pursued for a number of years by a very large governmental authority, for 12 years actually, which meant that I had to attend court on a number of occasions, and in most cases I had to defend myself because I couldn't afford a solicitor.
Yeah.
So that's just a background, so that you know where I'm coming from.
Thank you, David.
I gave you a submission initially because I was very pleasantly surprised that this inquiry happened in the first place, in that in all of my life, as far as I'm aware, this is the first time this has ever happened that there's been an inquiry in prisons. And I'm now 70 years of age. And you know, I think this should have happened many years ago, but it hasn't, I think mainly for political reasons. So that was, I just wanted to give you a background. That's the first thing. The second thing, I wanted to give you my overall response to your draft report, in that I thought your draft was excellent. It covered a lot of the points that I had hoped you would make. I don't think it went as far as I would like, but it did cover most of the issues that I was very concerned about. My initial submission, as you would be aware, was a lot of it was basically a sociological response, in that how society deals with people who offend against the norms and why they do that in the first place and what happens when they do. I mean, as I said, it was a general response because I haven't any, apart from my own interactions with the law, I have never been to a prison. I've been to a watch house and I've been locked up for 20 minutes in a watch house.
20 minutes.
20 minutes.
You're a hardened prisoner.
And that was quite an experience. This was quite a long while ago.
Right.
But it was something that I never forgot.
Yeah.
And the ensuing court cases opened my eyes to what happens in legal situations. Number two on my list is as I said, my overall response. I thought it was excellent, but there were issues that I wanted to expand upon, and I'm not going to sort of go through all of these. I just, in numbers 3, 4, 5 and 6, I definitely supported what you had to say in those pages 26 to 32. I thought they were right on the spot. However, I felt that the key issue to me was the issue of how to reform the justice system and the prison system. And that's where I've written down my point 8 there on your page 34. I thought that was the key element of a justice reform office. I think that is the best recommendation in your whole report. There needs to be a independent justice reform office. Now, I would like that reform office to have extensive powers where it's not subject to political interference. And for that reason, ideally, I think it should, such an office or an authority should have similar powers to the Reserve Bank, where it sets the rules which aren't capable of being overthrown by whoever's in government at the time. In regard to point number 9, I've got here the scope of criminal offences. As I mentioned in my initial submission, there are a lot of criminal offences that, in my view, should never lead to prison, and yet so many people are now in prison for what I would regard as victimless crimes and rather trivial offences. My view is that I think at the moment there are something like 9,000 prisoners in Queensland jails. Is it something like that?
Approximately.
My view is that I'm guessing that probably only 500 of those really need to be in a prison, in a secure prison, because they're dangerous or a real and active threat to society. In my view, the other people should either be in home detention or in some sort of open facility like they have in Mexico, which I don't know whether you've investigated that, but I mentioned it in my submission, that there is a prison in Mexico where the prisoners, there's no locks on the doors, the prisoners cook for themselves, they're free to do what they like, but I mean, they can walk out, but they know that if they walk out, there are consequences in that they won't be able to continue with those conditions. They'll be then put back in the general prison. And that was on the ABC, I think, about 3 or 4 months ago. My view is that people who are convicted of drug offences, particularly people who are there simply for possession, should never be in jail. Drug addiction, in my view, is a health issue, and it's not a criminal matter. Addictions of all sorts, society is riddled with them at the moment, and locking people up because they're a drug addict, I think, is just counterproductive. It certainly will take them off the drugs, but there's no long-term benefit to it. I also think that people who are imprisoned for non-violent offences, there needs to be another alternative. For example, a person who has worked for a corporation and in a position where they are in control of the finances and embezzled a significant amount of money, locking those people up for 4 or 5 years, I just think is a crazy thing to do. I think this is where restorative justice comes into the picture. I just don't think it's a relevant thing to do to lock up people for embezzlement in the same place as people who murdered a number of people. I just think that's a crazy thing to do. I hope you don't mind me talking.
Please, David.
Ad lib. I don't like people who talk from notes, because I think that deadens the whole situation. So I support your recommendations on reducing the scope for imprisoning people for victimless crimes. My understanding is that there's a whole range of offences still in our law where what I regard as minor offences, where people can still be locked up. Unless I'm out of touch, my understanding is that people can still be locked up for failing to pay a fine. if that's the case, that should never happen. So that covers my point number 10, basically, alternative policy approaches. Number 11, I do support restorative justice as far as possible. I think that does have limits. Obviously, where someone has been killed, you can't have restorative justice, but in a lot of situations, I think there is a lot of more scope for restorative justice, and I think in some overseas countries that has actually been done. I think that has a long-term beneficial effect on both the person who committed the crime and the victim. Number 12, the range of non-custodial sanctions. As I said before, I think home detention should be a real consideration for a lot of prisoners. I don't see any problem in people being required to wear ankle bracelets so that they can live a semi-normal life, but they don't have open access to society. I think that's a much more dignified way to deal with justice, and I would expect it to be a hell of a lot cheaper than $107,000 a year. Even if the people were brought their food and whatever supplies they needed, they've still lost their liberty in that they can't move outside of their property. The other thing I wanted to say briefly was about imprisonment and alternatives. It occurs to me that a lot of people, when they commit an offence, they don't just suffer one lot of punishment, they suffer at least two.
Terribly sorry, David. My mistake.
They suffer at least two in that they not only lose their liberty, but they also lose in normal cases, their employment as well. So that person who's embezzled that money, they've lost their job as well, and their future likelihood of getting employment has been significantly reduced. So I don't want to sort of jump about this, but that sort of basically leads me to the reintegration. I've got point number 16. I don't think there's been anywhere near enough emphasis put on how ex-prisoners are reintegrated into society. No doubt you would have heard from people here how difficult it would be for a person who, even with a non-violent crime, to get back into the workforce again, but my understanding from what I've read is that it's extremely difficult. And there seems to be very little opportunity for situations where those people are helped. My understanding is there's only one organisation, I think it's called Second Chance. Now I don't know whether you've talked with those people, but I would have hoped they might have made a submission to you. In regard to, I've got item 14 here, bail. To me, I find the situation at the moment with the courts and the speed with which matters are dealt with is just appalling. My understanding is that from the time a person is charged and who pleads not guilty to when a trial happens is at the moment something like up to 2 years or even more, in which time those people are then held in a prison on remand. And of course that's exacerbated by the overcrowding, which I probably don't need to really, because you've heard all about that.
We've heard some about it, yep.
I just think it's unacceptable that you can have 3 people in a cell and one of them sleeping on the floor I can't understand how any government can allow that to happen. Diversionary options, my last point. I'm running through these rather quickly because I know we've only got limited time. Diversionary options, I haven't had any association with the drug court, but I understand that is working well, and I think that's a positive matter. The more that people can be taken out of the prisons and put into other rehabilitation situations, the better. I did want to make a couple of other comments that I haven't mentioned on here, that I don't know whether it comes within the scope of your inquiry, but firstly, I strongly don't believe that any prison should be run by a corporation. In my view, prisons should be run by government.
Why, David?
Because a corporation is there for a profit, and that leads to all sorts of consequences of cost-cutting and potential mistreatment of prisoners. My understanding is that government in this state has made the decision now to do just that, that all prisons should be run by the government. I mean, to me, it's the same as basically saying that the fire brigade is going to be privately run. I just don't think it's acceptable. Now, just make a couple of other general comments. I think it's a real shame that the whole story about imprisonment and prisons is so little known. I've never actually seen a picture of what's inside one of our prisons. I don't even know what it looks like. I've never seen a documentary about it. The only thing that most people ever know about prisons is what they see in the cinema, and that's an American prison. I just find it unacceptable that we've got 9,000 people who are incarcerated and we don't really know what happens in there, the situation inside, the infrastructure. The closest we ever get is perhaps that an ex-prisoner will tell about what happened when he was inside. Yeah, I might leave it at that because I'm worried about running out of time. I've got a document here that is available off the internet. It's not, and I thought you guys might like to see that sometime. That pretty well follows what I have just said.
We'll take that, David, and ensure that's considered. David, you've got a little more time if you'd like to take it, or else we can
start on
ask some questions.
I'd just like to make one other comment that might not be all that pleasant, and that is that I took the time to read the official annual report of the department last year.
Right.
And I was absolutely appalled at that report in that it looked like it was run as a military organisation. All of the departmental people were all dressed up in uniform, and there was a whole mass of statistics in there saying what a great job they were doing, but there was no human aspect to it in my view at all. And the whole report ran to something like 50 pages, a huge document. And I don't think they addressed any of the issues that you're addressing here. It was purely about the number of people who'd been put in, the number of people who'd been taken out. There was nothing in the report really, as far as I could read, explaining about how prisoners were actually rehabilitated, how many prisoners were actually allowed to study or train to get back in the workforce when their sentence was expired. How many people were allowed to study for a university degree or a diploma. There was, as far as I could see, there was nothing in there at all about that. It did mention, how many people had escaped, which they said was very few, but maybe this is the sort of annual report that those departments are required to put in, but I just found it was totally lacking in any sort of compassion. Yeah, that might be. Oh, yes, there was one final thing. You've recommended a Justice Reform Office.
Yes.
Purely by accident, I noticed this in the media last week, that now the QSAC is asking for submissions on sentencing. First I'd ever heard about it. And hopefully those guys might be able to liaise with you when you're determining what you put in your final report. But I intend to put in a submission to this. That's it.
Good on you, David.
David, we have engaged with them and we will liaise. Our reports are similar timeframes and we've agreed to have further discussions about that. Thanks for your presentation. You obviously have some passion about some of these issues, I can tell that, and I really appreciate you taking the time today to come. Commissioner Fredericks, do you have a question for David?
Thanks, David, for presentation this afternoon and, for your submission and then providing the supplementary information around points too. So in regards to your submission, you recommend complete reform of the sentencing guidelines. And I'm just wondering if you think there are specific crimes or things that people have been sentenced for that probably warrant priority in terms of some of that reform process.
Well, my understanding is that every year in Queensland, I think I put this in my initial submission, that 25,000 people are convicted of summary offences. 25,000 a year, every year. I just think that's just outrageous. I've known a few people who've been subject to those because I personally have been in demonstrations and I've seen people who've been arrested over alleged public nuisance offences, and I was just outraged that this happened. You mentioned in your draft report, I think, that something to do with the discretion that police officers have. I think at the moment, personally, I think they have too much discretion. I think that there probably are some offences that need to be dealt with by the courts, but I think that the number is only a tiny fraction of what happens now. One of my acquaintances was arrested on a move-on charge and ended up having the court had to spend time dealing with his matter because he defended it. And the facts that I was aware of, the charge was just outrageous. And I think that leads to this whole justice system needs total reform in that the number of offences that are coming before the courts can't deal with them. This is why there's a 2-year delay in between people being charged and people being having to go to trial.
Yeah.
And although my relative is not in the legal system in this state, I don't believe there's much difference in any of the states in Australia. And the stories that I hear from her about what actually goes on in the justice system would make your hair fall out. And you would feel outraged by what's happened. I don't know whether that's answered what you.
No, that's fine.
I do really think that people who possess drugs for their own personal use, I think that's a matter between them and the health system. Unless they engage in violent acts. And I'll just make a final point. Everybody feels that we live in a free society. I think, and in my view, freedom is much overrated as a general situation, and I know that the Council of Civil Liberties wouldn't agree with what I have to say, but if a person is addicted to ice, continually addicted to ice, do they have the freedom to continue on with that without any intervention at all when it can lead to violence and death? And my rhetorical question is, wouldn't it be better for society to be able to detain those people, perhaps not in a jail, but detain them into a situation where they are no longer addicted? That might mean that their freedom is limited, but in the long run, society and that individual is much better off.
David, you're saying in that case, though, it's treated as a medical problem?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And why don't we have centres, masses of centres, dealing with those sort of people? And I like my individual freedom as much as probably anyone else, but to me, the matter of ice, I think, is a very, very serious one. And I would actually agree with what happened in Portugal, but I don't agree with decriminalising everything. I just don't believe that you can decriminalise ice, because I think the effects of addiction on ice are just so drastic. Which is probably putting me at about the freedom end of the spectrum in the population. But in my view, locking people up for MDMA and cannabis is just ridiculous. I'm trying to talk in a colloquial sense here. I hope you appreciate that.
You're doing a good job, David.
I've thought about this for a long time, and so I was absolutely appreciative of the fact that this inquiry's happened and that you've been able to give me the opportunity to put my point of view forward, because it's never happened before. I haven't given any inquiry, any submission like this in public for 10 years, and this is only the second time in my life I've ever done this.
Thank you.
So I feel very passionately about it. I try to look at things from a broad society aspect, not from an individual point of view.
Yep.
I think too much of society we're thinking about the individual aspect rather than the broadest.
Yep.
We're just about to come up to an election, and just about everybody's thinking about how does it affect me, instead of thinking how does it affect how I vote, how's it going to affect society as a whole, not just me. So this is where I'm coming from.
Yep.
I wasn't asking for a comment from you on that.
David, well done. Thank you very much. Bronwyn, do you have any further questions? Are there any comments from the floor on David's presentation today? It sounds like we don't have any. David, we really do appreciate you coming. You've talked some sense.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Well, just before one final thing, I also can't. No, this is not about your initial call for submissions. You've got 43 submissions for the whole of the state, and I was one of those 43. Only one of 4 individuals put a submission in, and I notice in the draft report you've only got 39, even less, of which 12 are individual submissions. And we've got a state with 5 million people. I think that says something about how society views this subject. And I just felt I had to say something.
we're glad you did.
I'm not obsessed about this, but I think it's an important issue that unless we treat all human beings as with respect as far as possible, no matter what they've done. And I think in taking it further, if we need to treat all living creatures with the same respect. And I'm not religious in the conventional sense, but that's all I want to say.
Thank you.
David, much appreciated. Thanks for the time. Thanks for doing this. As you said, not many people are prepared to bat up and sit in front of a microphone and speak their mind, and you have. So, well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dale.